We begin with a tale of how a simple, discreet medical procedure mutated into the most spectacular, terrifying, and frankly unhinged public relations catastrophe the British monarchy has ever endured, proving once and for all that in the digital age, a royal vacuum will inevitably be filled with absolute madness. Cast your minds back to those bleak, freezing days of mid-January in 2024, when the machinery of Buckingham and Kensington palaces seemed to grind to a sudden, inexplicable halt. Out of nowhere, the public was dealt a staggering double blow: the announcement that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been admitted to the London clinic for planned abdominal surgery, swiftly followed by the news that King Charles himself was seeking treatment for an enlarged prostate. To the untrained eye, it was simply an unfortunate coincidence, a synchronized stumble in the usually immaculate royal calendar. But for those of us who have spent decades observing the meticulous, almost obsessive choreography of the firm, this coordinated clearing of the decks signaled something far more profound and unsettling. The sheer gravity of releasing two major medical bulletins within hours of each other was unprecedented. A stark deviation from the usual drip feed of carefully manicured royal news. It was the moment the velvet rope was abruptly drawn across the grand stage, leaving millions staring at an empty curtain, completely unaware of the furious, chaotic scrambling taking place just out of sight. Behind the imposing ancient walls of Windsor, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable, almost suffocating tension. According to a well-placed source, the internal panic among palace staff was acute, as they found themselves utterly unprepared for the sheer scale of a dual medical crisis striking the very heart of the monarchy simultaneously. Imagine, if you will, the immense weight of pressure descending upon Catherine, a 42-year-old mother of 3 young heirs, suddenly thrust into a terrifyingly vulnerable physical state. Her internal monologue during those agonizing days must have been consumed not by the duty of the crown, but by the primal, desperate instinct of a mother trying to shield Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis from the sudden chilling reality of a severe health scare. Prince William, demonstrating a stubborn, fierce devotion that his own late mother would have immediately recognized, unapologetically cleared his diary, pulling up the drawbridge to retreat into the heart of his family. It was a profoundly human reaction, an absolute refusal to let duty override the fundamental necessity of standing firmly by his wife's hospital bed. Yet, while William prioritized the private sanctuary of his home, the machinery around him was beginning to falter, paralyzed by an antiquated belief that a polite request for privacy would be enough to hold back the tide of global curiosity. This tragically naive assumption would quickly become the fatal flaw in the palace's communication strategy, creating an unprecedented information vacuum that the internet was only too eager to exploit. The courtiers, seemingly frozen in a bygone era where a single dignified press release was sufficient to satisfy the masses, entirely underestimated the ravenous appetite of the 21st century digital public. They assumed that the modern populace, much like the deferential subjects of 50 years ago, would nod politely, accept the silence, and wait patiently until Easter for the princess to re-emerge in her Sunday best. A source within the inner circle noted that there was a distinct, arrogant complacency within the communications team, a stubborn refusal to adapt to a landscape where silence is no longer interpreted as dignity, but rather as a confession of guilt or a sinister cover-up. As January bled into February and the promised updates failed to materialize, the lack of any credible visual or narrative evidence created a fertile breeding ground for suspicion. The palace had inadvertently built an echo chamber of silence, failing to realize that when you offer the world absolutely nothing, they will inevitably begin to invent absolutely everything, setting the stage for a hysterical, conspiratorial wildfire that would soon scorch the very foundations of the Wales's carefully protected reputation. One cannot help but observe the bitter irony in this situation, particularly when casting a glance across the Atlantic toward Montecito, where a certain exiled duke and duchess continuously demand absolute privacy while simultaneously thrusting every manufactured grievance directly into the glare of the camera lenses. Catherine and William, conversely, genuinely sought quiet retreat, yet their silence was brutally weaponized against them by a public that feels an unearned sense of ownership over the princess's very existence. As the days ticked by with no photographs, no reassuring video messages, and no casual sightings of the princess, the initial wave of polite concern curdled into a feverish, restless demand for proof of life. The grand oak doors of Kensington Palace remained resolutely shut, and the official statements became increasingly terse, reciting the same tired lines about the princess doing well and reiterating the timeline for her return. But this corporate stonewalling only fueled the underlying anxiety. It felt less like a protective embrace and more like a fortress preparing for a brutal siege. A source behind closed doors whispered that the internal frustration was mounting daily, as seasoned advisors recognized the narrative was violently slipping through their fingers, yet they remained entirely paralyzed by William's absolute, uncompromising edict that his wife's medical details remain fiercely, unequivocally private, regardless of the spiraling public cost. The long-term consequences of this initial stubborn silence were disastrous, fundamentally fracturing the delicate, unwritten contract between the Prince and Princess of Wales and the global press. By attempting to enforce an ironclad blackout, the palace inadvertently turned Catherine's convalescence into the most compelling mystery of the decade, a puzzle that amateur sleuths and opportunistic gossips felt deeply entitled to solve. The tragedy here is not merely the failure of public relations, but the profound emotional toll exacted upon a family already grappling with an unspoken, terrifying reality behind closed doors. They were fighting a phantom war on two fronts: the very real, physical battle against failing health within the sterile walls of a clinic, and the rapidly escalating, entirely fabricated war being waged against their character and marriage on social media. This initial period of January and early February was the quiet before the absolute storm, the breathless moment the match was struck but had not yet touched the dry kindling of public hysteria. It was a masterclass in how institutional arrogance and a woeful underestimation of modern media dynamics can transform a deeply personal vulnerability into a catastrophic global spectacle, laying the groundwork for an inferno of rumors that no one inside the palace walls was remotely prepared to extinguish. The plot thickened, or rather, the narrative dam burst, on a cold Tuesday in late February, when the world witnessed a moment of such jarring professional abandonment that it sent shockwaves through every newsroom from Fleet Street to the Sunset Strip. Prince William, the future king, was scheduled to perform a deeply personal duty, a reading at the memorial service for his godfather, the late King Constantine of Greece, at St. George's Chapel. Yet, a mere 45 minutes before the service was to commence, the palace issued a cryptic, last-minute bulletin. The prince would not be attending due to an unspecified, personal matter. For a man whose entire brand is built on the keep calm and carry on stoicism of his grandmother, this was an unthinkable breach of protocol. A well-placed source noted that the atmosphere within the chapel was instantly transformed from one of mourning to one of muted, frantic whispering. Even the foreign royals in attendance were seen exchanging glances of sheer bewilderment. Behind the scenes, the internal monologue of the Kensington Palace staff was one of pure, unadulterated panic. They knew that by providing no context for such a high-profile withdrawal, they were essentially tossing a lit match into a warehouse full of dry tinder, and the resulting explosion was as predictable as it was catastrophic. Within hours of William's absence, the vacuum was filled by a Spanish journalist, Concha Calleja, who boldly claimed, without a shred of verifiable evidence, that the Princess of Wales was not merely recovering, but was in fact in a medically induced coma following post-operative complications. While the palace took the rare step of dismissing these claims as total nonsense and ludicrous, the damage was already done. The Coma narrative became the digital baseline for millions of armchair detectives. A source behind closed doors revealed that the pressure within the royal household was becoming unbearable, as senior courtiers found themselves trapped between a prince who demanded absolute medical privacy and a global audience that was now convinced the monarchy was hiding a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. William himself was reportedly in a state of simmering protective rage. He was watching the world dissect his wife's supposed demise while he was trying to navigate the very real, very private stresses of a young family in crisis. This internal conflict, the desire to protect his wife's dignity versus the professional need to stabilize the crown's image, led to a paralysis in decision-making that allowed the wildest rumors to take root and flourish. The atmosphere in Britain, and indeed across the Commonwealth, shifted from polite concern to a sort of restless voyeuristic mania. It was as if the public had collective amnesia regarding the concept of the medical leave. Because they couldn't see Catherine, they decided she no longer existed in the form they knew. A longtime family acquaintance remarked that the level of scrutiny felt predatory, a haunting echo of the 1990s paparazzi frenzy that William has spent his entire adult life trying to outrun. The long-term consequences of this late February disappearance cannot be overstated. It was the moment the missing Kate mystery transitioned from a niche internet hobby into a mainstream obsession. The palace's refusal to provide even a grainy, distant proof-of-life photo was interpreted not as a respect for her recovery, but as a confirmation of the worst possible outcomes. They had lost the benefit of the doubt, and in the court of public opinion, silence was being judged as a calculated deception. The irony, of course, is that while the world was inventing elaborate fictions about secret divorces or botched cosmetic surgeries, the reality behind the palace walls was likely far more mundane, yet far more exhausting. A family simply trying to cope with a serious diagnosis out of the public eye. However, by failing to manage the personal matter excuse with any degree of finesse, William inadvertently gave the conspiracy theorists their greatest gift, the appearance of a man who was no longer in control of his own household. A source within the inner circle suggested that the prince's stubbornness regarding his family's privacy, while admirable in a husband, was becoming a liability for the heir to the throne. The surrounding pressure was no longer just about Catherine's health, it was about the stability of the institution itself. Every hour that passed without a sighting of the princess added a new layer of absurdity to the discourse, turning a private medical recovery into a global spectator sport where the rules of decency had been entirely discarded. As we look back, the personal matter gaffe was the true point of no return. It signaled to the world that something was wrong in a way that planned abdominal surgery never did. It invited the public into the private quarters of Adelaide Cottage, asking them to speculate on what could possibly be more important to a future king than his godparents' memorial. The answer, we now know, was a father and husband prioritizing his wife's immediate needs during a harrowing health journey. But the palace's failure to frame it as such was a masterclass in how to lose a narrative. This period of late February was the moment the mask of royal invincibility slipped, revealing a family that was not only vulnerable, but seemingly incapable of navigating the very media machine they had spent decades trying to master. The stage was now set for the next chapter of this descent into madness, the rise of the TikTok tribunals where logic went to die and the most outlandish theories became the only currency that mattered. What followed was a descent into a digital purgatory, a period where the collective sanity of the internet seemed to evaporate entirely, replaced by a feverish, almost medieval obsession with the missing princess. As we entered the heart of March, the discourse moved from the hushed corridors of traditional media into the lawless neon-lit arenas of TikTok and Reddit, where logic is a secondary concern to the sheer, addictive thrill of a true crime narrative. It was here that the most outlandish, truly grotesque theories took root, that Catherine had fled the country after discovering an ultimatum regarding a divorce, that she was recovering from a Brazilian butt lift gone wrong, or, most chillingly, that she had been replaced by a body double while the real princess was being held in a secret bunker. To those of us with a shred of institutional memory, the irony was as thick as the London fog. A family that has spent centuries perfecting the art of being seen without being known was suddenly being dissected by millions of amateur sleuths with a ring light and a smartphone. A source behind closed doors remarked that the mood within the palace was one of sheer, bewildered horror as they watched their carefully curated reality being dismantled by teenagers in bedrooms who had decided, quite unilaterally, that the future Queen of England was a character in a Netflix thriller who had simply been written out of the script. The atmosphere surrounding the Waleses during this TikTok tribunal was one of a siege, but a siege conducted by ghosts, millions of digital voices that could not be reasoned with or silenced. One could almost feel the suffocating pressure bearing down on Adelaide Cottage, where William and Catherine were trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy for 3 young children who were now old enough to hear the whispers at the school gate. Imagine the internal monologue of a woman who is physically depleted, likely grappling with the visceral terror of a cancer diagnosis she isn't yet ready to share, only to discover that the world thinks she's been abducted or is hiding a surgical scar from an elective vanity project. It was a level of public cruelty that felt uniquely modern, a voyeuristic feeding frenzy that stripped away every ounce of her humanity. And let us not forget the shadow cast by the Montecito exiles. While Harry and Meghan remained uncharacteristically silent, the contrast was impossible to ignore. A certain dismissive skepticism pervaded the reading of the room back in Britain. There was a sense that while the Sussexes thrived on the oxygen of publicity, the Waleses were being suffocated by it. Yet neither couple seemed capable of finding a middle ground that didn't end in a public relations disaster. The consequences of this digital madness were profound, signaling a permanent shift in how the public consumes royal news. We have moved beyond the age of deference into an era of participatory monarchy, where every citizen feels they have a right to demand a receipt for a royal's whereabouts. A longtime family acquaintance noted that this period felt like a psychological breaking point for William. His long-standing justified loathing of the press was being metastasized into a hatred of the public's insatiable curiosity. He saw the very people he is destined to rule, turning his wife's medical crisis into a meme, a punchline, and a conspiracy. This wasn't just gossip. It was a fundamental breakdown of the social contract. The palace's traditional strategy of never complain, never explain, was being revealed as a relic of a pre-internet age, a wooden shield being used against a nuclear blast of misinformation. Every minute the palace remained silent, another 1,000 TikTok investigations were launched, each more deranged than the last, creating a narrative weight so heavy it threatened to crush the institution's credibility beyond repair. Behind the scenes, the pressure on the Kensington Palace communications team had reached a terminal velocity. They were no longer fighting a news cycle. They were fighting an algorithm that rewarded the most sensationalist lies. A well-meaning staff member described the internal environment as one of analysis paralysis, where every potential move was scrutinized for how it might be twisted by the conspiracy theorists, leading to a total cessation of productive action. They were terrified that any photo they released would be scrutinized for clues, yet they knew that without a photo, the fire would only grow. The long-term damage here wasn't just to Catherine's privacy, but to the very concept of royal authority. If the public no longer believes what the palace says, or if they believe they can force the royals to reveal their private lives through sheer digital harassment, the mystery and majesty that sustain a monarchy are effectively dead. This was the moment the Crown realized that the firm was no longer in charge of its own story. The digital mob had seized the pen, and they were writing a tragedy that no one in the royal household knew how to end. As we reflect on this descent into the Catespiracy, one has to wonder about the lasting psychological scars left on the woman at the center of the storm. To be ridiculed and theorized about at your lowest physical ebb is a trauma that no amount of royal privilege can mitigate. The surrounding pressure was not merely political, it was existential. The public's refusal to accept a right to privacy for a woman undergoing major surgery revealed a chilling lack of empathy that has now become the baseline for our interactions with the famous. The missing Kate phenomenon was a mirror held up to society, and the reflection was deeply unflattering. It showed a world that prefers a thrilling lie to a boring, painful truth, and a public that values its own entertainment over the basic dignity of a sick mother. This was the toxic landscape into which the palace would eventually launch their most disastrous counteroffensive. The Mother's Day photograph, a move that would take a bad situation and make it infinitely, inexplicably worse. The tension reached a fever pitch in early March when the first grainy, unofficial image of the princess surfaced. A paparazzi shot of her in the passenger seat of an Audi driven by her mother, Carol Middleton, near Windsor. To the cynical eye, it was a clumsy attempt at a soft launch to quiet the masses, but instead of quelling the flames, it merely added high-octane fuel to the fire, with the digital mob instantly claiming the woman in the oversized sunglasses was a body double or an impersonator. A source behind closed doors described the atmosphere at Kensington Palace as one of sheer, frantic desperation. The realization had finally sunk in that the public would no longer accept the written word as gospel. They needed a visual, a definitive proof of life to stop the global hemorrhaging of their credibility. This was the pressure cooker that birthed the most catastrophic PR miscalculation in modern royal history, the Mother's Day photograph. It was intended to be a masterstroke of domestic bliss, a radiant Catherine surrounded by her 3 laughing children, designed to signal to the world that the princess was not only alive, but thriving in the bosom of her family. Yet, as the image flickered onto millions of screens on that Sunday morning, the internal monologue of the princess must have been one of profound, exhausting conflict. Imagine the weight of expectation on a woman still in the throes of a grueling recovery, sitting at a computer and meticulously tweaking a family snapshot because she felt the crushing need to appear perfect for a world that had become her judge and jury. According to a well-meaning staff member, the decision to release the photo was handled with an almost amateurish haste, bypassed by the usual rigorous vetting processes because of the sheer urgency of the missing Kate narrative. Catherine, ever the diligent student of the visual arts, reportedly spent hours refining the image, perhaps seeking a sense of control over her own narrative that had been so violently stripped away by the internet sleuths. She wasn't just editing a photo. She was trying to reconstruct a shattered public image while her own body was still mending, a task that would prove to be a bridge too far for even the most seasoned royal professional. The surrounding pressure was not merely internal. It was a global, suffocating demand for a miracle. The palace had backed themselves into a corner where anything less than a flawless appearance would be dissected for signs of weakness or deception. When the photo was finally uploaded to the official social media accounts, the initial wave of relief was almost instantaneously replaced by a cold clinical scrutiny that no one in the Wales's inner circle had anticipated. Within minutes, the very people the palace sought to appease began pointing out the inconsistencies. The misaligned sleeve of Princess Charlotte's cardigan, the blurred zip on Catherine's jacket, the strange positioning of Prince Louis's hand. It was a digital autopsy performed in real time. A longtime family acquaintance remarked that the sheer speed of the backlash was dizzying, leaving the prince and princess reeling as their peace offering was transformed into a smoking gun of institutional dishonesty. The long-term consequences of this single ill-fated upload were devastating, fundamentally altering the DNA of royal communications. For the first time in history, the crown was caught in a lie that was verifiable by anyone with a Zoom function and a basic understanding of Photoshop. It wasn't just a botched photo, it was a catastrophic breach of trust that validated every unhinged conspiracy theory that had been circulating for weeks. If the palace was willing to fake a Mother's Day photo, the public reasoned, what else were they faking? The skepticism regarding the Sussexes' manufactured dramas in California suddenly felt like child's play compared to this. At least with Harry and Meghan, we expect a certain level of theatricality, but from William and Catherine, we expected the unvarnished, if manicured, truth. The Mother's Day fiasco stripped the Waleses of their greatest asset, their perceived authenticity. Behind the scenes, the fallout was nothing short of nuclear. As the international photo agencies began their unprecedented retreat, The palace found itself in the middle of a global humiliation that no amount of traditional stiff upper lip could mask. A source within the inner circle suggested that the finger-pointing within the communications team was vicious, yet the ultimate responsibility rested on a couple who were simply too tired and too besieged to see the trap they were setting for themselves. They had attempted to use a 20th century tool, a staged family portrait, to solve a 21st century crisis of misinformation, and the result was a total collapse of their narrative authority. The princess, who should have been focusing solely on her health, was instead thrust into the role of the sacrificial lamb, forced to prepare a public apology for a failure that was as much institutional as it was personal. This moment marked the end of the public's benefit of the doubt. The missing Kate mystery had evolved into Photogate, a scandal that transcended royal gossip and entered the realm of international news integrity. The atmosphere of Windsor, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage where every move was a potential mistake. The long-term damage to Catherine's personal reputation as a safe pair of hands was immense. She was no longer the infallible future queen, but a woman who could be pressured into a desperate, clumsy deception. As the kill notices began to roll in from the world's most prestigious news agencies, the palace realized they weren't just losing a PR war, they were losing the very foundation of their relationship with the modern world. The fallout from that fateful Mother's Day photograph was nothing short of a nuclear winter for the palace's public relations department, a moment of such staggering international humiliation that it effectively severed the remaining threads of trust between the monarchy and the global press. It was one thing for keyboard warriors on Reddit to squint at a digital artifact, but it was quite another when the world's most venerable news giants, the Associated Press, Reuters, Agence France Presse, and Getty Images, issued an unprecedented kill notice on a royal portrait. To the uninitiated, a kill notice is the ultimate professional rebuke, a declaration that a source is no longer considered reliable and that the provided material has been manipulated to a degree that violates the very soul of photojournalism. A well-placed source described the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace that evening as one of pure, unadulterated horror as seasoned courtiers watched the red X of censorship sweep across the image of a smiling princess and her children. The inner monologue of Catherine herself must have been a devastating mixture of shame and exhaustion. Imagine the psychological toll of being a recovering patient, already fragile, who then finds herself cast as a digital fraudster on the front pages of every global broadsheet. She had tried to give the public the perfection they demanded, only to be branded a liar by the very agencies that usually serve as the Crown's most loyal stenographers. The surrounding pressure was no longer about a missing princess. It was about an institution that appeared to be gaslighting the entire world. The cynicism in the air was thick enough to choke on, as the public realized that if the palace was willing to fake the sleeve of a child's cardigan, they were theoretically capable of faking anything, from a medical recovery to the state of a royal marriage. A source behind closed doors revealed that the internal blame game was vicious, with the communications team effectively paralyzed by the realization that they had lost their gold standard status in an afternoon. While the Sussexes in California likely observed this descent into chaos with a certain smug detachment, ironic given their own complicated relationship with the truth, the British public felt a profound sense of betrayal by the couple they had once deemed the safe hands of the monarchy. This wasn't the clumsy theatricality we've come to expect from Montecito. This was a failure of the fundamental integrity that William and Catherine had spent a decade cultivating. The long-term consequences of this Photogate were catastrophic, as it gave every conspiracy theorist a permanent, legitimate reason to question every official royal statement moving forward, turning the never complain, never explain mantra into a hollow joke. In an attempt to stem the bleeding, the princess was forced into the ultimate indignity, a public apology issued via social media where she admitted to experimenting with editing like any other amateur photographer. It was a staggering moment of institutional cowardice, allowing a woman recovering from major surgery to take the fall for a systemic failure of the palace's vetting process. A long-time family acquaintance remarked that the sight of Catherine being thrown to the wolves in this manner was deeply unsettling to those within the inner circle, signaling a breakdown in the protective shield William usually provides for his wife. The internal pressure on the Prince of Wales must have been immense. He was caught between his simmering rage at the media's intrusion and the cold, hard fact that his own office had handed the press the very ammunition they were now using to dismantle his family's reputation. The atmosphere at Windsor became increasingly insular, a bunker mentality where the royals felt persecuted by a public they no longer recognized and a press they no longer trusted. The international humiliation was compounded by the fact that the kill notice became a larger story than the original health concern, shifting the global conversation from "Is Kate okay?" to "Why is the palace lying to us?" The tragedy here lies in the fact that the palace's obsession with presenting a perfect image backfired so spectacularly that it made the reality, whatever it was, seem far more sinister than it likely was. A source within the inner circle noted that the sheer amateurism of the edit, 16 distinct errors identified by digital experts, made the monarchy look not just deceptive, but hopelessly out of touch with the capabilities of modern technology. They had tried to play a digital game with analog rules, and they had been utterly humiliated on a global stage. This was the moment the Kate mystery stopped being a niche internet hobby and became a legitimate crisis of state, a turning point where the crown realized that their word was no longer bond and their images were no longer trusted. The long-term damage to the princess's personal brand was particularly poignant. She had always been the reliable one, the royal who never stepped a foot wrong and who understood the visual language of the monarchy better than anyone. To see that reputation tarnished by a botched Photoshop job was a bitter pill to swallow, leaving her more vulnerable to the next wave of rumors than she had ever been in her professional life. The surrounding pressure was now existential as the palace realized they had to find a way to re-establish a baseline of truth before the entire institution was laughed out of existence. This period of Photogate was the lowest point of the crisis, a moment of total narrative collapse that left the Waleses completely exposed and the public more cynical than ever. It set the stage for the final desperate attempt to reclaim the story, a grainy video at a farm shop that would, incredibly, manage to make the public even more suspicious. Just when you thought the theater of the absurd had reached its final act, we were presented with the now infamous Windsor farm shop video, a piece of footage so grainy and contentious it looked more like a sighting of Bigfoot than a future Queen of England. On a seemingly ordinary Saturday in March, the world was gifted, via the pages of The Sun and the digital glitz of TMZ, a shaky smartphone clip of William and Catherine strolling through a car park clutching white shopping bags like any other suburban couple. To the palace, this was supposed to be the smoking gun of normalcy, the definitive proof that the princess was not only on her feet, but possessed the brisk, athletic gait of a woman well on the road to recovery. But in the toxic, hyper-analytical climate of Photogate, the video was received not as a relief, but as a provocation. A source behind closed doors revealed that the internal hope within Kensington Palace was that this natural sighting would finally silence the ghouls. Yet they utterly failed to account for a public that had already decided the real princess was nowhere to be found. Instead of a resolution, we got a fresh explosion of body double theories, with amateur sleuths measuring the height of the person in the video against gate posts and claiming that the woman walking beside William was far too bouncy to be a patient recovering from major abdominal surgery. The atmosphere surrounding this release was one of immediate aggressive skepticism, fueled by the fact that the video was shot by a bystander, Nelson Silva, who later found himself forced to defend his own eyesight against a global mob. Imagine the internal monologue of the princess during that walk. Perhaps she felt a flickering sense of triumph in simply breathing the fresh air, unaware that even her stride was being clocked by millions of digital coroners looking for a slip-up. She was performing health for a public that had become her most unforgiving audience. Meanwhile, according to a source within the inner circle, Prince William's protective instinct had curdled into a cold, focused resentment. He was walking beside his wife, trying to offer her a moment of ordinary life, only to realize that every step they took was being scrutinized for staged cues. The irony was suffocating. The more normal they tried to appear, the more fake the world insisted they were. The surrounding pressure had reached a point where even the most mundane act, buying a loaf of artisanal bread, was interpreted as a high-stakes piece of crisis management, a choreographed stunt designed to distract from a darker truth. The madness reached a new institutional low when professional journalists, including a well-known BBC sports reporter, Sonia McLaughlin, took to social media to publicly doubt the video's authenticity, suggesting it was obviously a pair of lookalikes making mischief. When the state broadcaster's own staff began peddling the very conspiracies the palace is trying to extinguish, you know the house is truly on fire. A well-meaning staff member remarked that the level of mainstream skepticism was a crushing blow to the royal household. It was no longer just the lunatic fringe on TikTok, but the very heart of the British establishment that was refusing to believe its own eyes. The name Heidi Aggen, a professional Kate Middleton lookalike, began trending globally as people flooded her social media, accusing her of being the woman in the video. The situation had devolved into a hall of mirrors where reality was no longer a prerequisite for belief. The long-term consequences of this specific fiasco were grave. It proved that the palace had lost the ability to settle a narrative through traditional means. The trust had been so thoroughly incinerated that even a clear daylight sighting was dismissed as a sophisticated deepfake or a cynical use of actors. Behind the scenes, the pressure on the royal couple was becoming an existential threat to their peace. They were living in a reality where they were being hunted by cameras, yet their presence was being denied by the very people watching the footage. One can only imagine the simmering anger in William's private thoughts, the realization that his attempt to shield his wife had inadvertently turned her into a ghost. Every detail of the video was weaponized. The Christmas decorations, supposedly visible in the background, led to claims that the footage was months old, while others argued that the princess in the video looked 10 years younger than the woman who had disappeared in December. It was a masterclass in confirmation bias. A longtime family acquaintance noted that this was the moment the Waleses realized that no amount of ordinary behavior would ever be enough to satisfy the hunger of the digital age. They were being asked to prove their humanity to a world that had forgotten they were human beings, transforming their private recovery into a grotesque interactive game of Where's Wally? This period of the Windsor farm shop sighting was the final desperate gasp of the missing Kate mystery, before the tragic, sobering reality finally broke through the noise. It represented the ultimate failure of the wait-and-see strategy, showing that in the absence of a direct, honest communication from the princess herself, the public would prefer to believe in a body double than a recovering mother. The cynicism regarding the Sussexes' constant need for the spotlight was briefly forgotten as the British public wrestled with a royal family that seemed to be playing hide-and-seek with the truth. The long-term damage to the Crown's authority was now undeniable. They had become a joke on late-night American talk shows, a meme on social media, and a subject of disturbing debate among their own reporters. The stage was now set for the only thing that could possibly end the madness, a direct, heart-wrenching confrontation with the truth that would leave the world in a state of sudden, shameful silence. The fever broke on the evening of March 22nd, not with a flourish of royal trumpets, but with the hauntingly quiet image of a woman sitting alone on a wooden garden bench. This was the moment the missing Kate conspiracy collided headfirst with a devastating human reality that no TikTok sleuth or cynical commentator was prepared to face. In a 2-minute video message that was as stark as it was courageous, Catherine revealed that post-operative tests had found cancer, and she was in the early stages of preventative chemotherapy. The internal monologue of the princess, as she sat in that Windsor garden, with the spring daffodils mocking her with their vibrancy, must have been one of profound, lonely resolution. Imagine the immense psychological fortitude required to look directly into the lens of a world that had spent weeks calling you a body double or a liar, and quietly explain that you have been fighting for your life. According to a well-placed source, the decision to film the message alone, without William by her side, was her own, a fierce, final reclamation of her own narrative from the digital vultures who had picked at her dignity for months. The surrounding pressure at that moment was a physical weight, a suffocating silence that descended upon the global media within seconds of the broadcast. The atmosphere in Britain shifted instantaneously from a restless, voyeuristic mania to a cold, bone-deep shame. A source behind closed doors remarked that the mood inside the palace was one of somber vindication, mixed with a protective fury that it had ever come to this. They had watched as a young mother was hounded into revealing her most private medical trauma, just to stop the world from inventing a more entertaining tragedy. One must also consider the quiet, dignified bond that had formed between Catherine and King Charles, both navigating the same terrifying diagnosis in the same cruel spotlight. While the Montecitans across the water issued a brief boilerplate statement of support, a gesture met with a certain dismissive skepticism by those who remember their previous broadsides against the family. The real story was the sudden, brutal humanization of a woman who had been treated as a digital avatar for 3 months. The long-term consequences of this revelation were a total, scorched-earth realignment of public sentiment. In an instant, the Kate-spiracy was exposed for what it truly was, a collective failure of basic human empathy in the face of a family's nightmare. The Photogate scandal, the farm shop body doubles, and the medically induced coma rumors all evaporated, leaving behind a bitter residue of public guilt. A longtime family acquaintance noted that this moment permanently changed the princess. She had seen the world at its most ghoulish and had been forced to pay a health tax of public transparency that her predecessors never had to endure. The palace, too, realized that their old ways were dead. The never-explained policy had failed because it assumed a level of public decency that no longer exists. They were now operating in a world where the only currency that buys privacy is a public confession of suffering, a grim bargain that will haunt royal communications for a generation. The psychological toll on the Wales children during this period is something that a well-meaning staff member described as the prince's greatest private sorrow. William's internal monologue was likely one of simmering protective rage, having to explain to George, Charlotte, and Louis why the world was saying such horrific things about their mother while she was upstairs undergoing chemotherapy. The irony is that the very thing the public demanded, the truth, was the one thing the family was trying to keep from their children until they were ready to process it. The surrounding pressure from the press and the public had effectively robbed 3 young children of a private, stable environment in which to understand their mother's illness. This wasn't just a PR blunder, it was a moral failure on a global scale, a reminder that behind every trending topic is a human heart that can be broken by the weight of a million unthinking clicks. As the sun set on that Friday in March, the Missing Kate saga ended, but the missing empathy crisis began. The long-term damage to the relationship between the Crown and the digital public is perhaps irreparable. We saw that the modern world does not want a mystery. It wants a victim. Catherine provided the truth, but she had to strip herself bare to do it. A source within the inner circle suggested that the Prince of Wales will never forget, and likely never forgive, the way his wife was treated during her darkest hour. The narrative had finally been reclaimed, but at a cost that is still being calculated in the private, hushed rooms of Adelaide Cottage. This was the moment the music stopped, the jokes ended, and the world was left staring at a woman on a bench, realizing that the intrigue they had been enjoying was actually a slow-motion car crash of a family's private grief. The sudden, almost violent silence that followed the princess's announcement was perhaps the most damning indictment of our modern age, as the very same voices that had spent months shrieking for the truth were suddenly, conveniently, struck dumb by the sheer weight of their own hypocrisy. It was a staggering spectacle to witness. Celebrities who had made "Where is Kate?" their entire digital personality were seen frantically scrubbing their social media feeds, while talk show hosts who had mocked her disappearance suddenly donned faces of somber, practiced concern. According to a well-placed source, the atmosphere within the palace was one of cold, silent contempt for this sudden pivot. There was a profound sense that the apology was not for the intrusion, but for being caught on the wrong side of a tragedy. The inner monologue of Prince William, observing this global backpedaling, must have been one of absolute, reinforced cynicism. He had spent his life warning of the predatory nature of the media and the public's voyeuristic streak. And here was the definitive proof that even a mother's battle with a life-threatening illness is considered fair game for a viral moment until the diagnosis is read aloud. The surrounding pressure didn't dissipate. It merely changed its form from a hunt for a secret to a performative display of grief. A source behind closed doors remarked that the royal family felt a profound sense of isolation during this period, realizing that the affection of the public is a fickle, dangerous thing that can turn into a feeding frenzy at the first sign of a closed door. The long-term consequences of this missing Kate saga are etched into the very fabric of the monarchy's future. It has permanently altered how William and Catherine will engage with the world. They have seen the mask of the people slip, revealing a ghoulish, insatiable appetite that cares little for the reality of human suffering so long as the content is engaging. One must wonder, with a touch of skepticism, how the duo in Montecito truly viewed this collective shaming of the British public, a public they so often characterize as uniquely cruel. Yet even their silence felt like a tactical retreat in the face of a reality that transcended their usual brand of victimhood. The legacy of early 2024 is not merely a story of a PR failure or a botched photograph. It is the story of a fundamental breakdown in basic human decency. A source within the inner circle suggested that the Princess of Wales emerged from this ordeal with a much sharper, more guarded understanding of her role. She is no longer just the smiling face of the firm. She is a woman who has looked into the abyss of public malice and chose to answer it with a dignity that her detractors could never hope to emulate. The atmosphere at Windsor remains protective, almost fortress-like, as the family prioritizes the long, arduous road to full recovery over the demands of the 24-hour news cycle. The long-term damage to the institution is the loss of its mystery. When the public demands, and receives, the medical records of its future queen as a condition of their loyalty, the magic of the crown is replaced by the cold, sterile light of a reality television show. As we look back on those months of madness, we must ask ourselves what kind of society we have become when a sick woman is hounded into a public confession of her trauma to satisfy a digital mob. The Missing Kate conspiracy was a mirror held up to the world, and what it reflected was a society that prefers the thrill of a lie to the burden of the truth. It showed us that in the age of the algorithm, empathy is a secondary concern to engagement. The princess is back, or at least she is visible again, but the world she has returned to is one that has proven itself to be fundamentally untrustworthy. A longtime family acquaintance noted that while the flowers and letters of support were welcomed, the scars left by the weeks of relentless, cruel speculation will likely never fully heal, serving as a permanent reminder of the price one pays for wearing a crown in the 21st century. Ultimately, this chapter in royal history serves as a chilling reminder that beneath the pageantry and the palaces, there are human beings who bleed, who fear, and who deserve the same basic privacy we would afford our own neighbors. The intrigue was never a game. It was a family's private hell played out on a global stage for the entertainment of the masses. It is a sobering thought to realize that the most authoritative thing the palace ever did was to finally stop talking and start fighting for the health of a mother, a wife, and a future queen. We have witnessed a tragedy of errors, yes, but more importantly, we have witnessed the resilience of a woman who refused to be broken by the very world she is destined to lead. The saga of the missing princess remains a dark stain on the digital age, a cautionary tale of how quickly curiosity can curdle into cruelty when we forget the humanity behind the headlines. It leaves us with a singular, uncomfortable truth, that the most valuable thing the monarchy possesses is no longer its jewels or its lands, but its dwindling right to be left alone. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I am curious to see if you feel the same sense of collective responsibility that this chapter demands. And if you value this unvarnished, perhaps slightly cynical look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth, however uncomfortable it may be.